On the behalf of the group Linhas Research Group, I'd like to thank you, David Matthews, again for accepting to join in our interview. I need to say that I'm a great admirer of your work, your book, and, and the research. And how can I say? I think that all the members of our group share this opinion, this academic admiration. Your book, Medievalism, A Critical History, is a very important reference for all of us. And then I think I can start with our first question. I would like you to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your academic backgrounds, academic formation, your main researches and books, a brief description of your main researches and books.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks really due to you. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's always interesting to me to speak to new audiences about medievalism. So, muito obrigado. It's probably the best that I can do. Shall I pause there for translation?
You can go on. It's fine. Continue.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Feel free to interrupt me. Well, yes, as you've quickly summarized, I've done a fair bit of work in what is called medievalism, but I started very much as a medievalist in the standard way. I was interested in medieval English language and literature. That's what I studied as an undergraduate. And although I was very interested in Old English literature, I eventually gravitated towards late medieval English literature or late Middle English literature. I didn't really concern myself with the later centuries until I became interested in the ways in which Middle English became a discipline of study, the ways in which, in especially the 18th century and the 19th century, Middle English was fashioned into a discipline of study. And my first book was called The Making of Middle English, 1765 to 1910. And that was published more than 20 years ago now. That book was, for me, a book in what I thought of as disciplinary history. I wanted to think about how, specifically, the discipline of Middle English was formed. And it was only after it was published that people said to me that I was working in medievalism. It was almost something I didn't know that I was doing. So there are different routes into medievalism.
If I may.
Okay.
Obrigado pelo convite. É sempre muito interessante falar sobre medievalismo com audiências diferentes, né? Como vocês bem resumiram, apesar do meu trabalho ser sobre medievalismo, eu comecei a estudar a Idade Média de forma bem tradicional, abordando a literatura na Idade Média, e só depois que eu vinha a pender para literatura medieval tardia, né? Eu só me interessei pelos séculos posteriores e pelo inglês médio, e a forma como o inglês médio foi transformado em uma disciplina no século XVIII e XIX, bem posteriormente, né? O meu livro sobre inglês médio ele foi publicado há mais de 20 anos atrás, e naquela época, depois que ele foi publicado, que me informaram que isso é, na verdade, um estudo sobre medievalismo, né? Propriamente dito. All right.
So, in many ways, I actually then tried to re-immerse myself in Middle English culture with my next book, which is a book called Writing to the King, which focuses on political verse in the 13th century and the 14th century, and really had very little to do with medievalism as such. But I got increasingly involved in, or I never really lost my interest in the disciplinary history aspect of medieval studies. And so I kept working on the 18th and 19th century material. And eventually, in a way, I sort of gave in to medievalism and began work on the last book that I published, which is entitled, it's already been mentioned, but which is entitled Medievalism, A Critical History. And that is thoroughly a book on medievalism studies that came out in 2015.
De muitas formas eu tentei me reemergir, né, no medievo, inclusive, né, escrevi o livro Writing to the King, escrevendo ao rei, versos políticos nos séculos 13 e 14, seria uma tradução aproximada. Acho que a gente não tem nenhum dos livros dele traduzidos, né? Não. Beleza. Mas mesmo assim eu nunca perdi o interesse no aspecto disciplinar da história medieval e continuei trabalhando com os séculos 18 e 19. E finalmente publiquei o Medievalism, A Critical History, né, o livro que já foi citado aqui anteriormente.
I suppose it might be worth my saying at this point, as a sort of larger explanation of how I came to this topic, that although, as you most of you will be aware, I currently work in Britain. I am actually Australian and grew up in Australia, chiefly in two cities, which are both by origin colonial cities, and also Victorian cities. And specifically the city of Adelaide, which is where I grew up, is known as the City of Churches. And those churches are, as you can imagine, Gothic churches. And the influence of Neo-Gothic is very extensive in Australian cities because they're created at the height of the Victorian period. So I grew up, in a sense, very far from the Middle Ages, but I also grew up with a very traditional British sort of curriculum and education. And I grew up surrounded by these neo-Gothic churches. And this, in some sort of sense, perhaps troubled me a bit, but at least it caught my attention to be surrounded by this kind of pseudo-medieval built environment.
Uma forma, assim, pode ser válido mencionar de forma mais aprofundada como eu cheguei nesse tópico do medievalismo, né? Eu nasci na Austrália, transitando entre duas cidades, cidades coloniais e vitorianas em origem, sobretudo Adelaide, que é conhecida como a cidade das igrejas, né? Igrejas influenciadas aí pelo neogótico, já que essas cidades foram criadas no período vitoriano. Apesar de ter crescido longe da Idade Média, fui criado com um currículo bem tradicional nos meus anos formativos, e sempre fui fascinado por estar cercado por esse ambiente do neogótico vitoriano.
Eu acho interessante apenas citar que, bom, ele está entrando também no que seria a nossa segunda pergunta, para falar sobre como começou essa relação dele com a Idade Média. David Matthews, I think that you are entering in our second question, that it's very important to us. When did your interest in the Middle Ages begin, and what were the factors and the elements? I think that you are started to talk a little bit about it, so I want to give you the opportunity to develop this.
Yes. Well, I've said something about the context in which I grew up, which I think was important. I was an undergraduate in Australia in the 1980s when it was still possible to do what was a pretty traditional kind of English literature curriculum. And I certainly did that and studied all periods as it was necessary to do. I, as I was saying earlier, gravitated towards medieval studies, and it was a pretty traditional sort of medieval studies. But probably the real answer to your question, or the sort of heart of it, the heart of the answer, is that when I came to finish my degree, my undergraduate degree, which was 4 years, I was doing traditional things. I was doing Old English, I was doing Middle English, I was translating things like Beowulf, I was doing some Old Norse. But when it came to doing my dissertation, I decided to do something that wasn't medieval. And the people, my teachers said to me that this was probably a good idea to diversify a bit. And so what I did was to work on the late romances written by William Morris. And perhaps I'll pause there because I've got more to say about William Morris. Perhaps I'll pause.
Então, eu fiz a minha graduação na Austrália nos anos 80, quando ainda era possível estudar um currículo bem tradicional de literatura inglesa, mas eu sempre pendi para os estudos medievais, né? Mas eu acho que o cerne da resposta à sua pergunta é que quando eu estava para terminar minha graduação, né, nesse período eu estudava um pouquinho de tudo. Eu estudava inglês médico, nórdico antigo, inglês médio, médio, nórdico antigo, e os meus professores pediram para que eu diversificasse um pouco os meus estudos. Foi quando eu encontrei o William Morris.
Yeah, so again, many of you will know, I'm sure, William Morris as an artist, a craftsman, a designer of books, an early socialist, and absolutely obsessed with the Middle Ages. He was involved with the group known as the Pre-Raphaelites in the middle of the 19th century. He also wrote a lot of medievalist poetry. So for me, I did quite a lot of work more on his prose than on his poetry. I wasn't specifically thinking about William Morris in terms of medievalism at the time, but it's impossible to think about William Morris without also thinking about the Middle Ages. So by about the mid-1980s, then I was thinking about standard medieval studies on the one hand, and 19th century reuse of the Middle Ages on the other hand. Theoretically, I could have been reading the journal Studies in Medievalism at that time. That journal started in 1979. I wasn't reading it. I don't think I knew about it. And it was much more difficult to get hold of things then with no online presence or such things. But essentially, I think the seeds were sown there for me in the mid-1980s. On the one hand, doing traditional medieval studies. On the other, reading William Morris. And doing so in an environment where I was surrounded by and still a little bit perplexed by neo-Gothic architecture.
Vocês, como medievalistas, devem conhecer o William Morris, artista, artesão e um um princípio aí de socialista. Ele estava inserido ali naquela cultura pré-rafaelita. Eu trabalhei com a sua poesia e a prosa, mas nunca exatamente pensei nele como um neomedievalista inicialmente. Sempre levei em paralelo os estudos medievais tradicionais, enquanto eu lia o William Morris, sem deixar de me sentir perplexo e por esse ambiente neogótico cercado por ele nas cidades australianas.
And what I would add to that, as an account of how my interest in medievalism was sparked, was that a little bit later I went on to doctoral study in another city, the city of Melbourne, which is, if anything, even more of a neo-Gothic city than Adelaide. At that stage, I was still seeing myself in terms of traditional medieval studies, and I began a PhD on Middle English, and specifically on Arthurian romance. At a certain point, I decided to look at how the romance of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight had been edited. This is a romance that was not known until the 19th century. It was only rediscovered in the 1820s. And so it was first edited in the 1830s. So there's a sense in which, obviously it's a medieval romance, but there's a sense in which it comes to us in modernity only through a Victorian perspective, and then later a 20th century perspective. I decided to investigate this and found that not much work, if any, had been done on it. The first editor of Gawain and the Green Knight was a man named Frederick Madden, who was the keeper of the manuscripts in the British Museum. And this led me onto a very long trajectory, which isn't finished yet. I'm still thinking about Frederick Madden. I've read all of his letters. I've read a very large amount of his extremely large diary, which is in manuscript. And it's through him, I think, that I realized my dual perspective of the 19th century reading the Middle Ages was the thing that I was going to get most involved in.
Eu fiz meu doutorado na cidade de Melbourne, mas eu sempre me imaginei como um medievalista tradicional, né? O meu doutorado foi em estudos arturianos e foi aí que eu me deparei com a obra Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Essa obra ela só foi descoberta no século XIX, ali por volta de 1830, e resolvi investigar acerca dessa obra, percebendo então que pouco trabalho havia sido escrito sobre ela. Frederick Madden foi o primeiro editor dessa obra, ele era guardião dos manuscritos no Museu Britânico, e eu meio que não terminei ainda de estudar esse assunto. Li as cartas e o diário do Frederick Madden, e é através dele que eu percebi essa perspectiva dual que me tanto chama a atenção entre o século XIX e esse neomedievalismo.
And that, I think, brings us almost up to date where my career in medievalism is concerned. It was the interest in Frederick Madden which eventually developed into the book I mentioned earlier, The Making of Middle English. The more I looked at what I was thinking of as the making of Middle English, the more I realized this hadn't really been covered in a comprehensive way, and that led me to think about things like the Early English Text Society, a person named Frederick Furnivall, who was a huge promoter of the study of Middle English later in the 19th century. But as I said earlier, it was possible to think about this in terms of disciplinary history, in terms of intellectual history, what is these days called the history of the humanities, without really thinking about medievalism at all. And that is really what I did. And it was only when I was contacted by the editors of Studies in the Age of Medievalism, which I think was in the early or mid-90s, that I began to think about medievalism specifically as a topic of its own. I published an essay on Walter Scott as an editor of Middle English, rather than Walter Scott as a poet or novelist. I published this essay in Studies in Medievalism in the late 90s, and that is when the different aspects of my interests and my career began to converge as a medievalist, as a person beginning to specialize in medievalism.
Esse estudo sobre o Frederick Madden e o Sir Gawain foi o que foi muito que me influenciou no livro que escrevi, o Making of Middle English. Isso me levou a perceber esse assunto mais em termos de uma história disciplinar, né? De um aspecto da história das ciências humanas. Foi só realmente quando eu fui contactado por editores lá no início, meio dos anos 90, que trabalhavam nessa área do medievalismo, que fui então me perceber melhor como um pesquisador dos medievalismos, né? Foi nessa época também que eu publiquei um ensaio sobre Walter Scott, editor de obras da época. João, por favor, se eu estiver esquecendo de alguma coisa, não hesite em...
Eu ia fazer apenas uma correção, Irã, que em algum momento você traduziu, quando ele falou de medievalismo, você colocou como neomedievalismo, mas ele tinha falado, de fato, medievalismo.
Só medievalismo. Perdão.
Só medievalismo. Tá, sem problema. Okay. And so I think you already answered our question about when you start your study in medievalism. But I would like if you can tell us a little bit more about the term neo-medievalism too. This is because in your book you even quote this term on page 39, but you do not go too far into it. And in your working model that you propose, you speak of Middle Ages as it never was, to try to explain this off-world medievalism. So what is your opinion and possible criticism about the term neo-medievalism? Just a minute, I need to translate in Portuguese. Eu estou perguntando para ele a opinião dele sobre o conceito, sobre o termo neomedievalismo, porque ele cita esse conceito no livro, mas ele não se aprofunda muito, e ele usa, né, esse termo para falar de uma Idade Média como nunca existiu, e para falar desse medievalismo off-world, que seria fora da realidade. E eu estou perguntando a ele qual seria a opinião dele e as críticas sobre esse termo neo-medievalism. All right.
Yes, interesting question, and it takes a bit of answering. First of all, the term medievalism in English has been around since the 1840s, it seems, and initially it's a slightly ambivalent term, and one which is obviously formed from the term, the adjective medieval, and it's not quite clear in the 1840s, and indeed for some time afterwards, whether a medievalism refers to something that is actually from the Middle Ages, or whether it refers to something that is some kind of imitation of something from the Middle Ages. So that there's that ambivalence in the term.
I may. I'm sorry, David. Since this is going to get a bit complex, I'd rather try to do this as slowly as possible.
Good idea. Good idea.
No, we have a problem.
Primeiro, o termo medievalismo em inglês existe desde aproximadamente 1840. Inicialmente, ele é um termo ambivalente, formado a partir do adjetivo medieval. Só que, na época, e até mesmo um pouco além, isso não se sabe se ele se refere a algo que é de fato medieval ou se é uma imitação da Idade Média, esse termo medievalismo.
So, at the time that I was describing before, in the 1980s and 1990s, I think a great number of people who were specializing in medievalism, who were looking at the 18th century, the 19th century, were themselves medievalists, like me, medievalists who just got interested in the later history and reception.
Nos anos 80...
No, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I mistook your pulse for. Nos anos 80 e 90, quem olhava para o século 18 e 19, eles eram medievalistas como eu, interessados em estudar a recepção e a apropriação dessa Idade Média.
So, to come to this term that you asked about, neo-medievalism, I think, if memory serves, this term is used in the English translation of Umberto Eco's famous essay, Dreaming the Middle Ages. I've always meant to check, but I never have checked, whether that appears in the original Italian, but I suspect that it does. Go ahead, no, that's right.
Para chegar no termo neomedievalismo, se me lembro bem, esse termo é utilizado na tradução do livro do Umberto Eco, Dreaming of Middle Ages. Clínio e João, me socorram.
É isso mesmo, na tradução em inglês do livro do Umberto Eco, Sonhando com a Idade Média, e o que ele fala...
O livro tem tradução para português? A gente tem esse livro traduzido?
Tem
não me recordo.
Não, eu não tenho ele. Tem traduzido.
É sobre ensaios e outros contos, alguma coisa. Esse daqui, ó. Tá até aqui, ó.
Eu só tive acesso a ele em inglês.
Sobre os espelhos e outros ensaios.
Nossa. Então, esse termo ele é utilizado na tradução desse livro do Umberto Eco, mas eu nunca conferi se ele de fato aparece no original em italiano, o termo neomedievalismo.
What I was going to say in relation to neo-medievalism was that this term is used in Umberto Eco's essay, and I have always thought that if we had simply adopted that word, if we'd simply adopted neo-medievalism when we were talking about later medievalisms and kept the vocabulary of medievalism and medieval studies for medieval artifacts, a lot of things would have been much simpler. But we didn't. We were already using the term medievalism in the sense in which it's used in the journal Studies in Medievalism. And what I was trying to say before was that there is this fundamental ambivalence in the very word medievalism, at least in English, but I think also in other languages as well, in which it's never, well, not always clear whether we mean actual things from the Middle Ages or whether we mean recreations and reinventions.
Esse termo, ele é usado no ensaio do Umberto Eco, como eu disse antes, mas eu sempre imaginei que se a gente simplesmente tivesse adotado essa palavra, né, o medievalismo, na hora de se referir às expressões tardias da idade desse universo medieval e as reapropriações, e tivéssemos mantido a palavra medieval apenas para falar daquilo que se refere à Idade Média propriamente dita, talvez as coisas não ficassem tão ambivalentes, tão ambíguas, tão confusas, algo que claramente acontece em inglês e, pelo visto, em outras línguas também.
So, in recent times, again, as you may know, the term neo-medievalism has been revived and has come to be used more extensively in a more specialized sense, referring to things that are now really quite distant from the Middle Ages, artifacts, practices, things like video games, and things that are really only sort of secondarily or perhaps at a third remove about the Middle Ages. And I said before that people doing medievalism studies in the 80s and 90s tended to be medievalists in a more traditional sense. That is no longer the case. We now see people who come primarily to the study of medievalism. It has become more independent as a form of study. And this is particularly true, I think, in what is these days called neo-medievalism. It refers in particular to people who are interested almost purely in the effect the Middle Ages has had, rather than what the Middle Ages actually was.
Em tempos recentes, o termo medievalismo foi revivido e tem sido usado... neomedievalismo, perdão. O termo neomedievalismo foi revivido e tem sido utilizado recentemente, especialmente para se falar de coisas distantes da Idade Média, como videogames e filmes. As pessoas dos anos 80 e 90, os estudiosos dessa época, eles eram medievalistas num sentido mais tradicional, que estudam a Idade Média, né? Hoje em dia, muitas pessoas têm vindo estudar isso, sobretudo com a preocupação do efeito que a Idade Média causa, mais do que estudar o que a Idade Média foi propriamente.
So, yeah, I perhaps don't have a great deal to add about neo-medievalism. A few years ago, I did organize or co-organize a conference on medievalism at my home University of Manchester. And that is where it really came home to me, just how much appeal this impact of the Middle Ages had on younger scholars, and how much of a new discipline, quite separate from medieval studies, this was becoming. So I think it's one of the really interesting aspects of what's going on in medievalism presently.
Há alguns anos atrás eu organizei uma conferência na Universidade de Manchester, e só então que eu percebi o apelo do impacto, que o impacto da Idade Média tem em acadêmicos mais novos, né, ao estudar esses temas.
So, I'd like to do another question. Vou fazer a pergunta, I'll do the question in Portuguese first. Eu vou perguntar para o professor David Matthews se ele está atualmente desenvolvendo algum novo estudo acadêmico, alguma pesquisa, e qual é essa pesquisa. So, Professor, have you been currently developing any academic study or new research? Which one?
My main interest for some time has been in something which I think many people will think of as a form of medievalism, though that's not my primary way into it. Put very simply, I'm interested in the continuations of Middle English in the 16th century. I'm interested in especially the way in which Middle English literature and culture survived the English Reformation and indeed flourished after the Reformation in many ways. And that is something that I regard as an extension of this disciplinary history that I've referred to before. I've always been interested in how Middle English was fashioned after the Middle Ages, and this particular preoccupation of mine is an extension of that.
Meu interesse primário tem sido o que algumas pessoas vão achar que é uma forma de medievalismo, só que não é bem assim. Eu estou interessado na continuação do inglês médio no século XVI e a forma como a literatura e a cultura do inglês médio sobreviveu e floresceu após a reforma anglicana. Esse tem sido o meu interesse primário.
You can probably gather from the way that I'm talking about this that in some ways I have wanted to distance this sort of work from the label of medievalism. The reason for that is that in the past, I think this is mostly in the past now, there was a bit of a snobbish attitude on the part of traditional medievalists towards medievalism. Perhaps there still is in some places, but really that I think is not so much the case anymore. And I used to want to be careful to keep this kind of work I was doing in history of the humanities a little bit separate from something that seemed to me was looked down upon at the time.
No passado, sempre houve uma reação meio snob por parte dos medievalistas sobre quem estudava os medievalismos, como se houvesse uma separação entre esses dois tipos de estudos, né? Sendo que um seria mais nobre do que o outro.
So that's something that I've been working on for some time. Whatever I call it or don't call it, it is certainly a kind of a study in the impact of the Middle Ages after the Middle Ages, or after what we traditionally call the Middle Ages in the British context. That's a thing that I've been working on for some time, and I hope to make that my next book. I think it's high time that I actually got it finished. But I should also say that I'm thinking about and remain interested in things that are more traditionally fall under the rubric of medievalism. I'm interested, very broadly speaking, something I've talked with Nadia Altschul about about global medievalisms, and that, of course, requires thinking about those places which have an investment in medievalism, but which did not have a Middle Ages in any traditional sense. Those places outside Europe and perhaps the Middle East, like your own country, like the country from which I come, which are invested in medievalism, but without the traditional Middle Ages. I remain interested in that. Perhaps I'll pause there for a moment.
Independente do que estudamos, a gente ainda está falando do impacto da Idade Média que ela tem, seja nos períodos imediatos a ela ou posteriores. Agora, algo que foi alvo de um dos meus livros e meio que cai na rúbrica do medievalismo foi também algo que conversei com a Nádia, sobre medievalismos globais. Lugares que têm esse interesse na Idade Média, mas não necessariamente passaram por uma Idade Média. Isso é algo que eu continuo interessado. Inclusive, a título de exemplo, o Brasil, ou mesmo o país onde eu nasci, no caso, a Austrália.
I have a book coming out next year. It's a collection of essays that I've done with a colleague of mine at Manchester, which chiefly focuses on 19th century British medievalism, so almost traditional, you might say. The difference in this book is that it is about what we're calling medievalisms from below, that is to say working class medievalism, feminist medievalism, socialist medievalism, beginning by asking the question, do these things exist? We all know about elite medievalisms of the 19th century. What do we know about what you might call subaltern medievalisms? So that's coming out next year. And that's led me back to the realization that I do still have unfinished business with 19th century medievalism, specifically, excuse me, the claim that I make in my book, Medievalism, that there's a burgeoning of medievalism in the 1840s in particular, in Britain, but also in a lot of other places across Europe, and perhaps not just in Europe. That is a claim that I certainly still believe in, but I would like to research it more deeply. There's a term, the medieval mania, which is a term that is actually used in the 1840s. It's used pejoratively to describe what's going on in the 1840s. That's something that I would like to explore further.
Livro meu que vai sair ano que vem é uma coleção de ensaios sobre medievalismos britânicos, que escrevi com um colega aqui da Universidade de Manchester. Ele é sobre o que chamamos de medievalismos vindos de baixo, ou seja, medievalismos feministas, socialistas, e nesse livro nós perguntamos se isso existe de fato. Afinal, nós conhecemos o medievalismo das elites do século XIX, mas será que conhecemos o medievalismo subalterno? Eu ainda tenho negócios inacabados no século XIX, especialmente sobre o florescimento do medievalismo na Inglaterra, mas também na Europa e até em outros lugares. Isso é algo que eu acredito, mas eu preciso ainda pesquisar melhor, né? E acerca disso, eu sei de um termo utilizado na Europa em torno ali de 1840, que é mania medieval, o que ele chamou de medieval mania, que era utilizado de forma pejorativa para se referir a esse processo.
So one thing that is obvious from everything I've said is that I have started out as a literary scholar, and primarily I've worked in departments of English literature. Medievalism doesn't really let you stay within literature. It's a phenomenon that operates across painting, as well as poetry, architecture, and art. It's one of the things that makes it challenging. I often think that some kind of study of the 1840s that is both long and wide, so to speak, would be interesting, that goes across nations, but also across genres and media. That is a deep and comparative study might be an interesting thing to do, almost certainly as a collaborative work rather than as the work of a single author.
Algo que é óbvio óbvio, a partir do que eu falei, é que eu comecei como um acadêmico da história da literatura. Só que a Idade Média não te deixa ficar só na literatura. Ela te faz ir para poesia, para pintura, arquitetura, arte, e isso é desafiador, né? Qualquer estudo sobre 1840 é necessariamente longo e amplo. Isso é algo que te leva a estudar sobre diferentes gêneros e tipos de mídia.
So,
Hi.
Right. Those are the things that I have on hand, and if I get to finish them all, I think that will be quite enough, and it will be time to probably retire then and do something else.
Essas são as coisas que eu atualmente estou me ocupando com. E depois que eu conseguir terminar elas, talvez seja a hora, então, de eu me aposentar e fazer outra coisa.
Professor, I would like to ask you if you can you underline and highlight the social relevance of those research? What are the main contributions to society?
Yeah, well, that's obviously a key question that you ask. I think that it's a question that can be asked and often is asked of work in the humanities in general, and I would say that work in medievalism studies is no less relevant, no less of a contribution than most other work in the humanities. I don't think we need to be defensive about it. More specifically, I suppose I would say that there are aspects of medievalism which are actually very, in very tense ways, connected to some of our big problems today. And this perhaps gives them, those aspects, an extra kind of relevance. Specifically, I was just actually been doing some writing in recent times, thinking about novels, medievalist novels, and thinking about the way in which, in the 1840s moment that I was talking about a short while ago, medievalism is usually very, very celebratory and nationalist in a celebratory sense. Sometimes it's a quite programmatic attempt to bolster cultural nationalism. Today, when medievalism is nationalist, it is very often nationalist from a very far-right perspective, in ways that I think are very unpleasant to many, if not most of us. Specifically, one could point to the way in which in France, the far-right Front National co-opts Joan of Arc, for example. Joan of Arc is taken to be emblematic of what France should be about. Joan of Arc is very white. Joan of Arc is made central to an exclusionary anti-immigration rhetoric, for example, among other things. And you could give a lot of examples of this. Medievalism being associated with far-right ideology. And that's perhaps an extreme example, but it is something that we who work in medievalism studies can think about and ideally try to work against. So I'll pause there.
Isso é uma pergunta-chave. É uma questão que pode e deve ser feita, sobretudo nas humanidades. Eu acho que a gente não precisa ser defensivos com relação a essa pergunta. Acho, sim, que há aspectos do medievalismo que estão conectados com problemas atuais. Mais especificamente, eu tenho escrito sobre romances medievais e pensando como esse período de 1840, o medievalismo é utilizado de forma nacionalista e celebratória, né, esse empoderamento do nacionalismo cultural. Agora, trazendo isso para um contexto contemporâneo, a gente pode falar do uso da extrema-direita, a exemplo da Front National, que usa a Joana d'Arc como um símbolo do que essa França de extrema-direita deveria ser, branca, excludente, xenofóbica. Isso pode ser facilmente associado com a ideologia da extrema-direita. E essas são algumas das coisas que a gente consegue associar e pensar entre os estudos do medievalismo e a contemporaneidade.
And if I could add to that a bit, I think that when medievalism studies began, it suffered a bit from the same kinds of things that cultural studies suffered from, cultural studies more broadly, which is that there was a perception that the sort of thing that medievalism studies was looking at was largely ephemeral and deservedly non-canonical. It's always the problem when you're looking at, you know, novels that haven't been read in a century, poetry that nobody reads anymore, and more recently, even more what appear to be even more ephemeral objects of study, like graphic novels and video games and so on. This usually creates a problem of perception, that the kind of thing that's being studied isn't that important. But the lesson of cultural studies is that those kinds of cultural productions are very important, politically speaking, at least. And medievalism studies has a role in trying to interpret that kind of material. At this point, people always invoke Karl Marx, who says that it's important not just to interpret the world, but to change it. I think that we have a limited ability to change the world, and perhaps shouldn't get too carried away by that capacity, but we're living in a politically very difficult time, to say the least, and our abilities to interpret it, I think, are very important, very relevant.
Se eu puder adicionar, eu acho que quando os estudos do medievalismo sofreram, eles sofreram um pouco do que os estudos culturais também sofreram. A percepção de que os estudos do medievalismo, eles estão olhando para algo efêmero, algo que ninguém mais lê ou estuda, tão efêmeras como videogames e graphic novels. A ideia de que essas coisas não são importantes. Só que a lição que a gente tem dos estudos culturais é que esses fenômenos são culturalmente importantes e os estudiosos do medievalismo, eles têm um papel em interpretá-los. Geralmente as pessoas invocam Karl Marx quando ele diz que é importante não só interpretarmos o mundo, mas também mudá-lo. Eu não sei se a gente tem essa capacidade plena de interpretar o mundo, mas considerando ainda mais os tempos politicamente instáveis em que vivemos, mas certamente devemos tentar.
Yes, I would like to take this last answer and make my last question. Eu vou aproveitar essa última resposta e fazer a minha última pergunta. Eu vou perguntar ao professor, na opinião dele, por que a Idade Média continua fascinando as pessoas em pleno século XXI, né? O que estimula esse gosto, esse interesse pela Idade Média? So, Professor David Netter, this is my last question. In your opinion, why the Middle Ages continues to fascinate people in the 21st century? What inspires or promotes the current interest or taste for the Middle Ages?
Another big question. You're asking the big ones. I often contemplate a version of your question. Sometimes I think it's worth stepping back as a medievalist and asking, well, is it the case that the Middle Ages have this special fascination or unique fascination? What about the classical period, which was influential for so long? What about the Renaissance? What about, in British culture at least, the Victorian period? Are these not very appealing today? And do we need to be a bit careful about the privilege that we accord to our period, the Middle Ages? Having said all of that, I do tend to think that the Middle Ages has a particular appeal. I do tend to think that it is an appeal that has a somewhat different quality to the appeal of those other periods. And saying exactly why is difficult, and is part of the ongoing work of medievalism. But I think it's got something to do with the perception of the otherness of the Middle Ages, which is an otherness that probably goes on appealing more and more as we seem to plunge into a kind of end of times pessimism, as we are more and more likely to identify our own time by using this term Anthropocene. All of this makes us ever more cut off from the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages consequently serves as a kind of useful other, and for many people, in many ways, a desirable other, which they want to retrieve, or at least to some extent explore. Perhaps I'll pause at that point.
Uma coisa que eu acho importante é dar um passo para trás e perceber se o período clássico, a Renascença, a Era Vitoriana, esses períodos também não são atraentes, né? A gente tem que ter um certo cuidado em não dar uma ênfase demasiada ao nosso período, primeiro de tudo. Mas eu acho que a Idade Média ela tem um apelo, sim, e tem muito a ver com a percepção de alteridade, né? Como a gente consegue se relacionar e se identificar até em parte com uma certa visão pessimista de fim de mundo, que podemos enxergar tanto no medievo e na nossa contemporaneidade.
It probably also makes a difference that for many cultures, for certainly, obviously for European cultures, but in a different kind of way for post-colonial cultures, they will see their origins in the Middle Ages in a way that they will not see their origins, say, in the classical period. Maybe this also makes a difference. The Middle Ages as an origin point, not something we necessarily want to privilege, because it feeds too readily into pernicious ideologies. But it's perhaps easier for many cultures to look back to the Middle Ages as a point of origin. This is something that Patrick Geary writes about, for example.
Possivelmente faz diferença o fato de que, para muitas culturas, obviamente para culturas europeias e talvez para culturas pós-coloniais, que elas vão enxergar as suas origens na Idade Média em vez do período clássico. Ainda que não seja algo que queremos ter o privilégio sobre isso, já que isso estimula ideologias perniciosas, como já escreveu sobre isso Patrick Geary.
So, Professor
Sure.
David Matthews, I would like to thank you again. Thank you very much. And I think that we can open to the audience.
Yeah, happily.
Lino, you
I'm-
have a question?
Yes, I have a lot of questions, but I think I do in French. It is a problem. You speak in English, but I'm speaking very well French. It's problem.
We can try and see how it goes.
Okay, I apologize with you, but my English is so terrible.
No problem.
I shame.
Trust me, it is a lot better than any Portuguese that I have. So, no problem.
Alors, je commence en vous remerciant. Je suis trop content d'avoir écouté. Si vous pouvez parler un petit peu sur votre dernière question, où vous avez dit sur la question de l'origine, c'est-à-dire le Moyen-Âge, toujours dans la culture européenne, est placé comme le moment où le monde occidental est né. C'est-à-dire, c'est toujours un rapport par rapport à l'identité. Et c'est pour ça qu'au Brésil et plusieurs des pays, nous avons cette attache avec le Moyen-Âge. Mais le Moyen-Âge est toujours, d'après moi, qui a étudié des procès, des canonisations, des trucs comme ça, c'est le moment de la culture chrétienne. C'est-à-dire, c'est le moment où le christianisme est né aussi. Mais je trouve bizarre que nous n'avons pas plusieurs des études sur le domaine du médiévalisme en attachant le christianisme, la religion et le Moyen-Âge dans le domaine de médiévalisme. C'est une question très importante, moi, parce que j'essaie de faire ce rapport, mais toujours on pose des problèmes sur ça. C'est la première question. Eu traduzo o que eu falei?
Então, eu entendi, Clínio, mas eu não sei se o resto do pessoal entendeu. Eu acho que pode valer a pena você traduzir assim para o pessoal.
Da questão principal da pergunta sobre a...
Na verdade, o que eu estou perguntando nele é assim, se a gente tem uma relação de identidade com a Idade Média, e a Idade Média é um momento em que o cristianismo nasceu, por que a gente não tem tantos estudos no campo do medievalismo e religião? Basicamente foi isso que eu disse, além de agradecê-lo. Professor?
Go ahead. I think you're right. If I understood you correctly, I think you're right about the relative neglect of Christianity as a theme within medievalism studies. I think you're also absolutely right to attach the importance of the birth of Christianity in the early Middle Ages to the ongoing interest in the Middle Ages. I think that it's probably been relatively neglected in the study of medievalism because that study commenced initially with an interest in medievalism and politics, certainly in the British context. A book that I have not yet mentioned, but which always gets mentioned in this context, is a book entitled A Dream of Order by Alice Chandler, which was published in 1970, I think, and is regarded as a foundational text in the study of medievalism, at least in English-speaking culture. And that book, if you know it, was especially focused on the way in which people like John Ruskin, Thomas Carlyle, other 19th century thinkers seized on the Middle Ages for political answers in a politically troubled time. But of course, you're right that what they were also interested in was some kind of refashioning of Christianity in a way that was inspired by the Middle Ages. Thomas Carlyle makes this quite explicit in his book Past and Present, which was published, I think it's about 1843. I don't think I'm too far wrong if that's not the date. And it's also, incidentally, around that time that the very word medievalism begins to be used, specifically in the context of religion. Medievalism as a term initially refers only to religion before it diversifies. Perhaps I should pause at that point before I get carried away.
Thank you. Eu acho que é importante relacionar o nascimento do cristianismo ao interesse contemporâneo na Idade Média, sim. Ele possivelmente foi relativamente negligenciado pelo interesse em medievalismo e política, que é onde os estudos começaram. Um livro que é sempre mencionado nesse contexto é o A Dream of Order, do Adam Chandler, que é um texto base para os estudos de medievalismo, pelo menos nos países de língua inglesa. Pelo estudo que esse livro traz sobre escritores como John Carlyle no século XIX. Mas você está certíssimo. Nós talvez possamos perceber isso melhor nos escritos de 1843, de Thomas Carlyle. E sim, a palavra medievalismo ela foi utilizada inicialmente num contexto religioso.
So I wonder, is that an answer to you? Have I approached your question, I guess, first of all? Est-ce que ça c'est une réponse qui va bien pour
Oui, c'est très bien. Oui, c'est juste pour que nous puissions penser un petit peu sur ça. Parce que comme j'ai étudié des procès de canonisation, je suis capable de voir dans les discours religieux plutôt fondamentalistes aujourd'hui des rapports très étroits avec le Moyen-Âge, mais parfois les collègues chercheurs qui n'ont pas un rapport très étroit avec la religion au Moyen-Âge, la religion entre guillemets, parce qu'elle n'existe plus au Moyen-Âge aussi, mais c'est difficile. J'ai beaucoup bavardé avec Nadia, par exemple, pour la dire qu'il y a quelques rapports entre la religion et le médiévalisme, mais qui n'a pas un rapport tout à fait évident. Il est toujours subtil et il est fait par la notion d'autoritas, de la parole chrétienne. C'est-à-dire, si on parle de Saint Thomas, c'est pour dire qu'il n'a pas nécessaire faire des explications. Et c'est comme parfois Dieu parle. Et cette rapproche avec la religion aujourd'hui, nous avons ça au Brésil. Nous avons cette notion très, très, très bizarre, entre guillemets, mais qui n'est pas rationnelle. C'est le Moyen-Âge enchanté où Dieu parle, les démons aussi. Toujours, nous avons ce rapport avec, qu'on appelait, entre guillemets aussi, dans la notion d'église, ecclésia en latin. C'est ça, c'est juste pour que nous puissions toucher cette champ qui n'a pas encore été travaillé. Mais je commence à faire ça, mais je trouve beaucoup de problèmes pour le faire.
I think the kind of thing you're talking about is something that I have probably neglected a bit in work that I've done. I talked at the beginning about the neo-Gothic churches with which I was surrounded when I was growing up. I think that, as you will have realized, I was talking about them chiefly as part of the built environment, and not so much about the obvious religious signification. And I suppose that has a lot to do with the fact that I was growing up in a relatively secular society, and I have no experience of Brazilian society, none whatsoever. It's not something that it's not a country I have visited, and I've perhaps thought a little too much about the outside of the church and not so much the inside of the church. That said, one of the novels that I talk about in my book on medievalism is an interesting one from this perspective, and one which certainly lends itself to what you're saying. It's the French novel by J.K. Huysmans, La Cathédrale, which was published very early in the 20th century. I forget the exact date, and which brings home to you the absolute centrality of a Christian spiritual medievalism. It's a book which was published in the wake of the Dreyfus affair in France, amid concerns about anti-Semitism at the heart of French life. It's a book which reaffirms a very French form of Christianity, and it was a book that, despite the fact nothing happens in it, it's about nothing but a man wandering around the Cathedral of Chartres and describing what he sees, was an enormous bestseller, and it clearly, struck a chord with the that still very spiritual kind of strand of a supposedly lay, supposedly in the context of laïcité in France. So all that's by way of saying that I think what you raise is something that does need to be explored further in the context of medievalism.
O que você fala é algo que eu negligenciei um pouco. Eu falei no início sobre como as igrejas neogóticas me cercavam. Eu acabei escrevendo e falando do ambiente em que elas foram construídas e menos do simbolismo religioso delas. Talvez porque eu cresci numa sociedade secular. Eu sempre pensei mais do lado de fora da igreja do que do lado de dentro. Sobre esse assunto, um romance que eu tenho lido de um escritor francês, J.K. Huysmans, se chama La Cathédrale, publicada no fim do século XIX, e é essencialmente sobre um homem e a sua relação com a Catedral de Chartres. Foi um best-seller na época, e aborda isso, só que dentro de um contexto da laicidade francesa, né? O que você disse é realmente algo que ainda precisa ser mais estudado.
And just very quickly, and I'll finish on this topic, but just very quickly, of course, today what we're seeing in the collocation of religion and medievalism is often this very pernicious medievalism, whereby a medieval saint like Joan of Arc is linked to extreme right ideology. And that, of course, brings the whole thing into disrepute.
E muito rapidamente, atualmente o que a gente tem visto na inserção da religião no medievalismo é como isso é utilizado de forma perniciosa, a exemplo da Joana d'Arc.
Thank you. I apologize speaking in French, but I can't speak in English very well. So we have here the same problem with the representation of the religion for extrema direita.
The far right.
Far right. Thank you.
Yeah.
My microphone was
I think this is a rather global phenomenon, given that the United States is also going through something somewhat similar.
Eu acho que
João, perguntas.
There
Tem
are
duas perguntas no chat
questions
para traduzir também.
of Maria Eugênia.
Ok.
I think there is the first question. It's Maria Eugênia.
Yes, that's hers. Professor, according to you, do you think it is possible to think the Middle Ages as a concept and not just a historical period, a concept built according to a specific context and interests from the built from specific interests and contexts based on the reuse, the reappropriation of the period itself? Was that clear?
Yes.
Okay.
I think that in a strict sense, the Middle Ages is only that set of concepts that has subsequently been put together, been created. We talk a lot about periodization. We talk a lot about limits on this and that epoch or era. We seem unable to, we seem to want to question traditional notions of period, and especially that one which divides the Middle Ages from modernity. It's much under question. At the same time, we seem in many ways unable to let go of it. But I think absolutely that beyond that, mostly what we're talking about when we talk about the Middle Ages is something we have constructed since. Perhaps I'll pause, which gives you a chance to translate a bit and me a chance to think a bit.
Fair enough. Isso é algo realmente de interesse nosso. Nós falamos muito sobre periodização e limites dessa ou daquela época ou era. A gente se questiona muito o que divide a Idade Média da modernidade, mas de muitas formas não conseguimos abandoná-la mesmo assim. Eu acredito que muito do que se fala da Idade Média é algo que temos construído desde então.
Yeah, I hope that I hope that is an adequate kind of answer. Really, I think this is the subject of ongoing work. There's the traditional idea is that the Renaissance invents the Middle Ages for its own purposes, but that idea is under question, questioned by people like Kathleen Davis, and I know you know Nadia Altschul, of course, and her work. So it's an ongoing thing.
Eu espero que isso seja uma resposta adequada. Isso é o tópico de um trabalho em andamento, né? Essa ideia de que essa ideia tradicional de que a Renascença inventa a Idade Média, questionada pela, perdão, qual foi o nome da autora?
Nadia e Catherine Davis.
Catherine Davis, que com certeza a Nadia conhece.
O microfone tá ligado? Tá ligado.
Tá sim. Sim. Ok. Maria Eugênia, respondido?
Nós temos uma pergunta do Marcelo também.
Ok.
Marcelo Santiago.
Professor, you mentioned Marx and the need to change the world. In your book, Medievalism, A Critical History, you use concepts from Raymond Williams, a known British Marxist. Taking that into account, I'd like to know if you consider yourself close to the theoretical perspective of Marxism, and if so, just like other thinkers, just like other scholars, if you had moments where you got closer and then subsequently far away from Marxism, if you have this kind of approach and step back moments.
Well, to try to put it briefly, I referred to my undergraduate and postgraduate study earlier in the 1980s, and certainly when I was doing my postgraduate study, a Marxist approach to medieval literature was then being pioneered, and I was certainly very interested in it. I think it then morphed into or adapted into a more broadly historicist approach, what is sometimes called new historicism. And I think I probably went along with that. So far as all pertains to medievalism, I think that one of the things that you know we've all come to realize is that the answers of traditional historical materialism do not fully answer to our current predicament. That our need to readjust our economies now more than ever involves a recognition of things that Marxism didn't really anticipate. Our sort of fantasy of ongoing growth, our capacity to reboot ourselves by just making more and yet more, is something that, well, Marxism makes a critique of that, but I think it's evident to many people we need a greener kind of form of materialism these days. I seem to have wandered a long way from medievalism. I think the link here is that when I was writing my book on medievalism, I never wanted to just write off what seemed to be people looking for political answers and sort of future-oriented answers in medievalism. I never wanted to look at somebody who was trying to create a medievalist-inspired commune and say, well, that's just fanciful, it's not going to work. It's as hopeless as the political prescriptions of the 1840s. I always wanted to try to find if there was some liberatory possibility amid the fantasy, if you like.
Okay. Resumidamente, eu falei dos meus estudos de graduação e pós, e na época a ideia de uma abordagem marxista para a literatura era novidade, então eu me interessei por isso. Isso com o tempo foi se transformando numa abordagem neo-historicista. Agora, em relação ao neomedievalismo, acho que as respostas do materialismo histórico tradicional não atendem às nossas necessidades, como, por exemplo, a necessidade de readequação do mercado que a gente tem hoje em dia, a nossa capacidade de nos reiniciar e nos reinventar e superar através simplesmente de produzir mais e mais e mais. Eu acredito que precisamos de um materialismo histórico mais verde, mais ecológico e mais recente. Eu, no entanto, nunca vi ninguém querendo criar uma comuna neomedievalista.
Okay. I think there is Nadia and Maria Eugenia.
Yes.
True.
Okay. So Nadia asks, speaking of your...
I think Nadia speaks...
no.
I can translate my own question if you want.
I yield the floor. I yield the floor.
So I wrote it in Portuguese. The question, it's not really a question, it's just I am very curious, and I also think it will be really interesting in the context of Brazil and the fact that in these post-colonial locations, medievalisms can sometimes be different. If perhaps you could tell us from the book that is coming on this, what you called subaltern medievalisms, if you could tell us a little bit more about what are these alternatives that you might have found before it comes out?
Yes, absolutely. As I briefly mentioned, the question that we posed was my colleague Mike Sanders works in 19th century studies, and I'm a medievalist. He is particularly interested in Chartism, that was a popular rebellion in the 1830s and 1840s, which sought mostly, but not exclusively, by peaceful means to bring about political reform. And we simply asked the question, well, we know about, anyone who works in this area knows about, let's say, Walter Scott's Ivanhoe. We know about the Eglinton Tournament, which was the a reenactment of a medieval tournament in 1839. We know about the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and so on and so forth. In other words, we know all about what are clearly elite medievalisms coming from within the aristocratic upper class or an upper middle class of intelligentsia. What about the working classes? What about the female perspective? What about early socialism? Did such perspectives use medievalism and, as it were, throw it back at elite medievalism? Or did they turn their backs on, did such people turn their backs on medievalism as something which was already the tool of the elites? First of all, perhaps shall I pause and let you do that part of it, and I have another bit which I'll add.
Essencialmente, nós nos perguntamos, né, se há alternativas a esse medievalismo da elite. Nós conhecemos o Invanhoé do Walter Scott, nós sabemos que em 1839 houve uma reencenação de torneios medievais, sabemos de diversas expressões dos usos dessa Idade Média pelas elites, mas não sabemos tanto dos usos dessa Idade Média pelas classes mais populares, né? É o objetivo do nosso livro investigar isso.
So it seems fairly clear that there are not, for example, from the working class perspective, there isn't the equivalent of, say, a novel like Ivanhoe. It just doesn't exist. But we went looking among more ephemeral cultural products in newspapers, periodicals, and what we found was pretty convincing evidence that, in fact, there was extensive use of medievalism in a political sense by working class people, and a use that was specifically designed to be countered to elite and conservative, usually conservative, medievalism. The project began with a specific interest in working class medievalism, but it grew as it went along. And we have a really nice essay by Carolyn Collette on suffragism and women's campaign to gain the vote in Britain, and their deployment, quite extensive deployment of medieval imagery, and a use of, for example, the imagery of chivalry in the service of women's suffrage and the campaign for the vote, which is interesting in that chivalry we usually think of as something being used in the service of traditional masculine ideologies. Another example of something I think that was really a discovery we made, it's fairly well known that in the first half of the 19th century, the medieval heroes, Robin Hood and King Arthur, were the subject of a lot of interest. Of course, they've been known for a long time, but King Arthur is not much written about, not much known at the beginning of the 19th century. By the middle of the 19th century, he's a famous figure. We found that there's a third figure who was equally well known and equally important in the first half of the 19th century, almost always from the perspective of resistance, political resistance. And that figure is a real historical figure, Wat Tyler. And Tyler was one of the leaders of the 1381 revolt in England, sometimes called the Peasants' Revolt. That's not really a very good name for it, but a revolt which was taken up in the 19th century as a kind of symbol, a precursor of 19th century working class resistance. And Wat Tyler is everywhere in ordinary culture in the first half of the 19th century. He's in poems, he's in cartoons, he's invoked in political speeches again and again. But because that takes place in largely ephemeral art forms, it's basically been forgotten.
Nós sabemos da época através de produtos mais efêmeros, como jornais do período. Encontramos que o uso do medievalismo foi muito utilizado num sentido político pela classe trabalhadora, especificamente feito para ser uma resposta à elite. Esse trabalho começou sendo sobre as classes trabalhadoras, mas eventualmente expandimos. Caroline Collett, ela tem um excelente artigo sobre o sufragismo e a campanha das mulheres para ganhar o voto. E como essas mulheres fazem uso extensivo de imagens medievais e o uso do cavalheirismo a favor delas. É algo que vai contra o senso comum que a gente tem do cavalheirismo como forma de reafirmar de reafirmar o machismo. Né? Figuras como Robin Hood e o Rei Arthur, apesar de serem alvo de muito interesse, o Rei Arthur, por exemplo, não é muito conhecido no início do século XIX. Uma figura muito mais corriqueira nesse período é a de Wat Tyler, que foi um dos líderes da revolta de 1381, também conhecida como Revolta dos Camponeses, apesar desse nome não ser muito ideal para o fenômeno. Essa revolta ela é utilizada no século XIX como símbolo e precursora dessa resistência trabalhadora do XIX. Né? Então o Wat Tyler está em todos os lugares, poemas, charges, discursos políticos o tempo todo, enfim. Shall we move on?
Thank you for that, David.
Thanks, Nadia. Thanks for the question.
Okay.
There is the question of Maria.
Okay. Maria Eugenia asks, considering from the perspective of the literature studies and the medievalism studies, and the notion that the Renaissance created the Middle Ages, can we study Dante Alighieri as a character that served to be taken as as a figure, at transition arc. Thanks, Ron. Was that clear?
It's
Yes.
absolutely clear. Absolutely clear. It's a tricky question. As you know, the traditional thinking is that Renaissance, when it arrives at different times in different places. So conventionally, Quattrocento in Italy is self-consciously thought to be Renaissance, whereas you don't really speak of Renaissance in England until the 16th century. At the same time, it's been observed that the use of Renaissance as a period term, as a term actually meaning a period of history, isn't really a Renaissance thing at all. It doesn't come until the 19th century, and historians like Michelet and Burckhardt. So I suppose, strictly speaking, in that sense, Dante can't really be a transitional figure to a period that does not know itself to be a period. Here I would definitely say that I'm by no means an expert in Italian literature or even in Dante, and I think that the kinds of things that Dante is trying to pioneer and create have more to do with local concerns, local in the sense of Italian concerns, and I'm saying nothing new here. Things like the dignity of the Italian vernacular, most obviously. That's one of Dante's famous creations. I guess I find it a difficult question, and I guess I am wary of answers that that would pin crucial historical transitions on one movement or one person. And I suppose I'm also wary of major cultural figures' own self-creations and projections of major transitions. I hope that makes sense and doesn't sound too evasive.
Primeiramente, a gente tem que entender que a Renascença ela chega em diferentes lugares e em diferentes períodos. O Quattrocento na Itália é bem renascentista, se percebe como renascentista, mas na Inglaterra só vai se falar em Renascença no século XVI, né? E ainda temos que levar em consideração que a percepção de que o período da Renascença ele só é entendido como uma renascença no século XIX, através do Michelet e do Burckhardt. Então, num sentido tradicional, o Dante não pode ser um marco transicional de um período que não se reconhece como um período. Eu não sou especialista em literatura italiana, mas o Dante está inserido em preocupações mais locais, como a criação do vernacular italiano, né? Essa é uma pergunta muito difícil e eu tenho cuidado em dar respostas que fixem marcos em períodos que criam ou projetam as nossas percepções de determinados períodos.
Ele, no final, apenas também destacou que não gostaria de ser evasivo, né?
Demasiadamente evasivo.
Perdão.
Bom, eu não sei se eu poderia, mas o Luiz... deixa o Luiz...
O Luiz pode fazer direto em inglês.
Se sobra tempo... Não, primeiro, Luiz, faça a pergunta em português para o público entender e depois faz em inglês, por favor.
Ok, vocês estão me ouvindo?
Yep.
Não, a minha pergunta é mais... Assim, em primeiro lugar, pedir desculpa que eu só consegui entrar no finalzinho, minha internet estava dando uns problemas aqui, mas minha pergunta é na linha do último comentário que ele fez sobre neomedievalismo, na pergunta sobre marxismo, perguntar o que ele entende como neomedievalismo. Eu sei que ele falou um pouco durante a fala dele, da ligação com Humberto Eco, mas se ele pudesse expandir um pouco mais sobre isso, porque ele fala de construir uma comuna neomedieval, e aí eu queria entender nessa linha, o que seria o neomedieval, então? Seria uma reencenação do medieval? Enfim.
No sentido político, mais.
Oi?
No sentido político do neomedieval?
Sim, eu queria... O que ele entende pelo termo mesmo? O que ele quis dizer aí? Com neo. Por que neo, nesse caso?
You can speak in English now?
Posso falar inglês agora?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So, first I apologize for missing your talk, because I had some connection issues early this morning. But, well, my question is actually connected to what someone asked about Marxism, and you answered talking about a neo-medievalist commune. So I wonder, what do you understand by neo-medievalism? And why specifically neo-medievalism commune and not medievalistic commune? I know you talked about it a bit during your presentation, and you mentioned the connections of neo-medievalism with Umberto Eco. But if possible, I would like you to expand a little bit more in what you understand by the word neo-medievalism and what it means for you. Thank you.
Sure. This is going back a little bit over some ground that I covered earlier, but briefly, I think that neo-medievalism makes perfect sense as a term, and I think it would work as a term for what it is that people like us investigating the impact of the Middle Ages do. But things don't always work out neatly that way, and the term medievalism without the neo became embedded, at least in the English language, but from what I understand it's also the case in French and in other languages. So I don't I guess I've often used neo-medievalism and medievalism as almost interchangeable, but these days there are people who are specifically involved in what they want to call neo-medievalism, and which they want to differentiate from the more traditional medievalism studies as it has existed since the late 70s and towards the end of the 20th century. So it's not, I don't make a big thing about it, but I do want to sort of respect the fact that there are people who are trying to fashion this neo-medievalism field around computer games and graphic novels and some of the cultural objects that are more removed from the Middle Ages, if that makes sense.
Okay. O neomedievalismo, ele faz sentido como um termo e funciona como um termo para pessoas que, como nós, investigam o impacto da Idade Média. Só que as coisas não funcionam tão perfeitamente, e o medievalismo sem o neo, ele está entranhado na língua inglesa, assim como no francês e outras línguas. Eu uso neomedievalismo e medievalismo de forma intercambiável, só que há aqueles que preferem distinguir uma coisa da outra como campos diferentes. Eu não faço tanto essa distinção, mas eu respeito quem esteja querendo criar um campo específico relacionado ao fenômeno das graphic novels, dos videogames, das mídias mais contemporâneas.
I wonder if I could ask a quick question on the back of this. Because it's come up a couple of times, does this expression neo-medievalism have a particular meaning or sense for you in Brazil? And what indeed is the terminology that you use in Portuguese for medievalism?
Luis, let me translate the question first. O professor quis também fazer uma pergunta para o Luis, que é: essa expressão neomedievalismo, ela tem um significado particular para a gente aqui no Brasil? Qual a terminologia exata que a gente usa para se referir a esses fenômenos?
Okay, so trying to answer that, I don't think neo-medievalism has a specific meaning for us here in Brazil. I mean, some of us who are studying this, we have our own conceptions of it, and we use definitions by different authors. So I know, for example, I use one, and João Batista here uses a different one to talk about different things. But as a general sense, there isn't much of a specific meaning for the word. Now, the fun fact here is that medievalism, the word medievalism, is not used academically here in Brazil to mean what we understand as medievalism, at least not until very recently. So most papers and books that mention medievalism here in Brazil a few years before, they are using the term to mean medieval studies as a whole. So when they say medievalism, they could be saying medieval studies. So there is that. But neo-medievalism, I think most people I've read talking about it, or I've talked to, and they use it in Brazil, they're usually drawing from Pamela and Clement's definition in studies in medievalism, and to talk about those more recent things. Although I remember having a talk with Nadia a couple of years ago, and someone asked this question about medievalism being used here in Brazil to refer to medieval studies, and she presented neo-medievalism as some sort of solution. Just call it neo-medievalism then, to differentiate. So it is somewhat like you proposed. Does that answer you?
Yes, that's interesting. Thank you. Yeah, it's and it was certainly the case in English, in the English language. What you said about medievalism was certainly the case in the 1980s and 1990s. The term medievalism was used in that loose sense. Why not? Because we who practiced it were called medievalists, so it made sense that the thing we were doing would be medievalism, and that's always been the problem with that term. But as I said earlier, I think it's too late, to make that that particular change. But it's always made for a kind of a creative tension and a creative ambiguity at the heart of what we do, between medieval studies on one side, medievalism studies on the other side.
Question?
Okay. Is she going to ask it live, or should I translate?
No, it's here in the chat.
Okay. So Professor Tamires asks, Leslie Workin and other authors, they raise the question on how the French people study the Middle Ages outside Europe. And she also brings a criticism that I think it's important for Brazilian scholars, because she points out the colonialist relationship. For example, the Legoff's concept of long Middle Ages, and the British tradition is slightly different. Could you tell us, how do you perceive this difference?
The difference between a British tradition and a specifically French tradition, is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, the the Jacques Le Goff idea, which is mentioned in the question, is one for which I have a lot of sympathy, and which briefly, suggests a very, very long and extended, what he calls an extended Middle Ages, right down to the Industrial Revolution, which he and others regard as the great important mutation. He does not deny the Renaissance, but suggests that there are many Renaissances, greater and lesser, in what is overall called, what he wants to call an extended Middle Ages. I think that's that contrasts certainly with the British tradition. Probably the principal reason is that British historiography has always given a great deal of importance to the establishment of the English Church in the 1540s, 1530s and 1540s. Arguably, it has given too much importance to that establishment for the obvious reason that some of its original importance was precisely to separate Britain from European or continental European historiography. So where do I go with this? I have a lot of sympathy with and interest in Le Goff's extended Middle Ages idea. I have a lot of interest in that kind of more recent historiography that diminishes the importance of the 1530s, 1540s as the crucial divide between periods in British historiography. I feel, though, that we've seen a lot of arguments of various kinds over the past 30 years or so for, in one way or another, an extended Middle Ages. And I'm thinking here not so much of Le Goff as of Eamon Duffy, the Irish Catholic historian, who's been very influential in saying that the contrary to a common idea, the English Reformation did not occur because the medieval Catholic Church was exhausted in Britain and was on its last legs. In fact, as Duffy argues, the medieval Catholic Church was still going perfectly strong in all kinds of ways in the 1530s. And, I agree with that conclusion, but I wonder now if we need to move on from our debates about periods and about how long the Middle Ages were or were not, away from debates that are essentially about temporal linearity, and perhaps move more towards a model that sees a kind of temporal hybridity, a model that is able to see medieval things continuing to exist for sure, but in contexts in which something has mutated, something has changed, in which some apparently changed temporality exists. Maybe I'm not putting this too well, but I'm interested now in sort of more folded models of temporality as pleated, a bit more difficult than our models of linearity, where things either did or did not endure for specific lengths of time. Sorry for the length of that answer.
A ideia do Le Goff é uma pela qual eu tenho muita simpatia. Ela sugere, né, uma longa Idade Média até a Revolução Industrial. Ele não nega a Renascença, mas ele entende que há diferentes renascenças. E isso há com certeza contrastes com a historiografia inglesa, que se ocupa muito do estabelecimento das igrejas no século XVI, onde há aí um distanciamento da historiografia continental. Eu tenho, sim, muito interesse na longa Idade Média do Le Goff, Já tive muitas discussões sobre isso. Uma, inclusive, com Amy Duff, uma historiadora irlandesa, que afirma que a reforma não aconteceu porque a Igreja Católica medieval não se suportava mais. Muito pelo contrário, a Igreja Católica medieval prosperava durante o período. Agora, se a gente realmente quer se afastar dos debates sobre linearidades temporais, marcos temporais, talvez devêssemos pensar mais em debates sobre um hibridismo temporal, focado nas mudanças e nessas mesclas de período, modelos de temporalidades que abranjam mais as diferentes características. E peço desculpas pelo tamanho da resposta.
So, I think we have already exceeded the time limit. And I would like to thank you again, Professor David Matthews. It was a great pleasure to talk to you and listen and all this knowledge that you share with us was very important to our research group. Thank you very much again. Eu gostaria de agradecer a todos os presentes também, que estão aí até agora. Já ultrapassamos 2 horas de entrevistas. Clínio, Irã, se vocês quiserem se despedir também do professor David Matthews. Professor, goodbye. I hope to see you soon. And again, I thank you very much.
I just want to say thank you. Thanks very much for listening, and thanks for your questions. It's been a great pleasure. Merci bien, muito obrigado, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. And I would love to have an opportunity to talk to you, because given that the amount of questions asked, I didn't get enough time. But if we may speak later, maybe off record.
You're welcome. You would be welcome to do so. Yes. Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'm great. Je suis très content. Je parle toujours en français, c'est plus facile. C'est juste pour vous remercier, parce que c'est trop important à nous, parce qu'on commence à travailler avec les médiévalismes au Brésil, et nous avons aussi trop de difficultés, parce qu'ici, nous avons encore ce problème que nous sommes placés dehors de la vraie recherche sur le Moyen-Âge. On commence vraiment à faire ça maintenant, alors c'est trop important avoir une personne comme vous ici pour aider à penser sur cette domaine qui a déjà trop développé chez vous. Merci beaucoup.
Si je peux vous aider, ça me fera très content, très content. C'était un grand plaisir.
Merci.
All right.
All right.
Thank you. Obrigado a todos e até quarta-feira que vem. Quarta-feira que vem teremos um historiador português, Pedro Martins, vai falar sobre o medievalismo em Portugal, início do século XX, se não me engano. Acho que o tema principal da nossa conversa será essa.
Obrigado, pessoal.
Obrigado.
Tchau, tchau.